Dr. Holmes, we'll start off with what exactly does it mean to be American? What are our values?
Well, for the history of the country, we've taken our values mostly from the principles and values of the American founding. It was a set of rules in our Constitution and the principles laid out in the Declaration of Independence that framed for not only Americans at the time of the founding, but for Americans in perpetuity, how we should see ourselves as a nation and as a people. And the most important thing we have to remember is that the values of that time, when the Constitution was ratified and the American Revolution, they were based on the idea of natural law. And that is that the laws and the rights of mankind were given to us by God or God's nature. And so therefore they were permanent and they were universal. And part of that idea is that government was instituted to protect people's rights. Those rights were individual in nature. The purpose of government was to ensure that not only those rights are protected, but also that no one person or one central power could get enough power to abuse those rights. It was also understood, mainly because of the influence of religion throughout the history of our country, that not only all rights, but all responsibilities, including personal and public, were individual. In other words, on the one hand, we may be given rights and we have freedom, but in order to exercise that freedom properly, we had to exercise personal virtue in our lives. And so therefore, it was understanding of morality as personal virtue combining with the liberty, if you will, of the Constitution that gave Americans their creed, if you will. And we've been living with that creed now ever since. There are many in this country today that have been questioning it. It's been questioned by the progressive movement for well over a century. But that's what it meant to be American for most of our history.
And just to expand on that a little bit, you mentioned that people are questioning the founding right now. Why is it important that we understand the meaning of the American founding right now?
Well, because it is being questioned. It's being questioned by people on the left. Progressives have been questioned, as I said, well over a century. Woodrow Wilson and some of the progressives at the turn of the 20th century were saying that the Constitution and the founding was outdated even a century ago. And then throughout the last century, in the 1960s, it was challenged, and it's being challenged today by the progressive left. Essentially, they want to replace it with a sort of a cultural Marxist view of groups competing with each other for power, either gender or race or whatever. And the idea of individual rights has been, at least politically, on the one hand, perverted in the sense that it's not really about natural rights anymore. It's about what can the individual gain through identity politics, and what can they gain in terms of their own personal pleasures by depending upon government. This is not the way Madison and Jefferson and Washington looked at it. So the founding is it's enshrined in our constitutions. It not only gives us the rules of government, but it also gives us a moral bearing of who we are as a people. As I said a minute ago, we call it the American Creed. And so if we move away from it and it gets off track, whether it's from the left or from the right, we will lose our identity as a nation. And the great mix of morality, individual rights, of freedom, and religion that we've had for the last 250 years of our nation, that wonderful balance will be completely lost. And if we lose that, we will lose our greatness as a nation.
Absolutely. And you've written and you've hosted events and lectures on the topic, which we're going to link in the comments below for everyone to see. We have a lecture you had called Why American Exceptionalism is Different from Other Nations' Nationalisms. Could you explain that?
Well, it's conservatives for many years have accepted the idea of what we call American exceptionalism. And by that, what we meant is that what was unique about the country that made it so successful? It wasn't really so much about bragging rights as it was an historical and moral observation about the kind of mixture of morality, religion, and liberty in the American context that made us a great nation. That's what I mean by American exceptionalism. It's a beautiful idea. It captures both the reality and the ambiguity of the American experience. It's based upon the creed that I just mentioned a minute ago. America's founding principles: natural law, liberty, limited government, individual rights, the checks and balances of government, popular sovereignty, that is, that the people have, it's the people and not the state that governs the government, and the state is a servant of the people, not the other way around. Religion, unlike in Europe, was seen as a mediating and even a secular civilizing role, if you will, in the sense because we had religious freedom, the different people with different religions could still agree on liberty and also on the underlying rightness of the morality of religion. And also civil society is separate from government, and the civil institutions, particularly the family, was absolutely critical to the success of our democracy and our freedom. And so that's what I mean by American exceptionalism, is there was no other nation on earth that was founded on natural law in the way America was. And we derive our legitimacy of our belief in natural rights from natural law. The French have a very different view. The American Revolution wasn't like the French Revolution. It draws on a whole different set of principles. The American Revolution, as I said, was a beautiful blend of the morality of religion and the political ideology of liberty.
All right, and great question here. How do we maintain a moral standard while the opposition has no moral virtue? They're willing to betray to push a narrative. So how do we maintain that?
I get that question quite often. The answer I've been giving for over 30 years is, it's two parts of it now. The first question is always tell the truth. The truth shall set you free. But the truth gives you not only the confidence that what you're doing is correct and right, but eventually you'll have a lot of material with which to try to persuade people. So don't lose confidence in yourself. That's the first one. The second one is avoid the temptation of fighting fire with fire. One of the reasons why the left has been successful for the last 50 years is they have developed all kinds of techniques of misinformation, of twisting the meanings of word, actually almost gaslighting American history by saying something is not what it appears to be. They've taken the idea of individualism in natural rights theory and turned it into kind of a libertarian notion of personal gratification, which is not meant that way at all. They've taken the idea of equality before the law, which was the original understanding in our Constitution, and turned that into a Marxist socialist idea of equality of outcomes and income equality and the like. They've been doing this for a very long time. I don't want our side to do the same thing. Sometimes this may happen with this concept of nationalism that we can talk in a minute, where we feel that that our idea of fusionist conservatism or the idea of limited government is not strong enough to stand up to the progressive left, and therefore we're going to have a very strong idea of the nation state to fight that. That will not work, because it goes so much against what we believe in the American creed that we Americans are, is that we'll end up giving our birthright, and we'll lose our liberty, we'll lose our freedom, and actually we'll lose our values in the process as well.
And if you would mind expanding on that a little bit, you've hosted an event and you've written an op-ed that's on heritage.org that we will link as well, called The Problem of Nationalism. So what is the problem of nationalism, and how is that different from other nations' nationalisms, or American exceptionalism? How is that different?
Yeah, for many years we used the word American exceptionalism quite consciously to avoid calling it nationalistic, because nationalism had a lot of bad associations, not only in history, because it was associated with militarism and racism in Europe, but also because it was European in origin. It was the tradition of nationalism in Europe was that the nation state, and a very powerful nation state, would carry on the sort of common values of either an ethnicity like the Germans or the French, or religion, and it was really just about the sort of just things that made them different from other countries in Europe. That's what nationalism was. It's a history of it. There's a long history of it, and so American exceptionalism, since it's based upon a creed, it's not based upon ethnicity. We've got all kinds of ethnicities in America. It's not even based upon the language. English language is not what sets Americans apart. I mean, we all should speak English, but it doesn't make us unique. It's not, it's not really what makes us a great nation. And so nationalism is a rather weak read to put American exceptionalism on, because American exceptionalism is based upon the idea of a universal creed, whereas nationalism talks about how people are different from other people. I think that the mistake is made is that the kind of vernacular word of nationalism today in America it's kind of divorced from its history. It kind of, people think, well, it just means that there's an American nation, and what's wrong with that? Well, yeah, of course there's an American nation. But there's people who've written books about the case for nationalism that by saying it's actually different from the American creed. And I just don't understand that, because the American creed and the civic nationalism, if you will, that was associated with the American creed for over 250 years is what made us all distinctly Americans. It's what made us exceptional. So I don't want to lose that. I don't want to associate the greatness of America with some narrow concept that the Europeans came up with. It's got a troubled history anyway. But on top of that, it's way too cramped of an idea to capture the greatness and the universality of the American idea. I just think that we need to remember that because the American creed is based upon, as I said, natural law. Nationalism is not.
And you've mentioned a lot of great things about why America is exceptional. We have a question here. What is America exceptional at doing? Is there anything specific that you could list?
Well, you have to look at our history, particularly in the 20th century. There's no other nation in the history of mankind that fought in two world wars, World War I and World War II, came out of it victorious, and actually had a good part of the world, and not the Soviet Union as part of the world, but a good part of the world, the free world, rally behind the victor and identify themselves with the values and the virtues of that country, that it became a universal creed for the rest of the world. And so it was, people looked to us and they trusted us after World War II and even during the Cold War because we practiced what we preached. They knew that we had values, and our power was based upon the trust in those values. That is unique. That's American exceptionalism in action. I would say also the ability to bring in the civil moralities of religion, from different kinds of religion, into a kind of a political creed through religious liberty that allowed people from all over the world to come to America, Catholics, Protestants, Jews. It didn't really matter. You came here and you could be an American, and all of their religions would be respected. It's hard to do that. I don't know any other country that does that, that did that as well as we did, and still do. And I think also, we always had a belief in the free economy, the greatness of the American economy growing for 2 centuries gave us the wealth that made us successful as a nation on the global scene. And so the wealth, the morality, the power, it was just an exceptional story. And it's really wondering whether or not we can keep this magnificent blend of things that came to us as a legacy from the past going forward. And it's not so clear, because right now we're clearly in a crisis. And I'm not just talking about COVID, but also a political crisis. And there's a good part of the American electorate that no longer believes in what I'm saying. And even some people in the Republican Party no longer really believe in American exceptionalism the way I've described it. So this is a very valuable legacy. And I just think that we have changed it over time. It's not about a rigid ideology. It was flexible enough to change with the times, but the basics had to always stay the same. It's economic freedom, liberty, limited government, individual responsibility. All of these things work together in a political culture that made us a magnificent country.
Absolutely. And I think you just hinted at this a little bit, but question here, what is the greatest threat to American exceptionalism?
Loss of confidence in all the things that I'm saying, concluding they're no longer true, that they've been passed by time, that they're no longer relevant to the problems we're facing. We have to come up with a new idea of America. And this is what progressives have been doing well over a century. They gave up the original idea 110 years ago. And then in the 1960s, they really gave it up. But conservatives, they hung on to it. It was the whole fusionist conservative movement put together in the 1950s, William F. Buckley Jr. and Ronald Reagan. That gave us, for the last century, half a century, the foundation for us to grow. But there are some people who see themselves as conservatives that think that philosophy is no longer relevant. So they're saying, well, there's too much individualism in America today, so we need to have a powerful state to enforce morality, as I see it. This is in theory no different than what the left is doing, And I just think that we must always keep in our minds the formula of liberty without freedom is not truly free, and virtue without freedom is not really virtue, and freedom without virtue is not really freedom. The original founders really believed that freedom was the perfect practice of virtue. So it wasn't about getting rich and going out and having a great time at a party. That's not what they mean by liberty. They mean having the freedom to choose what is right for you and your family, and allow civil society and the churches to define what that is, and through your individual conscience. That's the magic mix, if you will, of American history. It's served us very well, and it's just being challenged. Mostly the culture is being weakened, and some people no longer believe in it. Some conservatives don't believe it's strong enough, and people on the left believe it's just flat out wrong.
All right, well, just a reminder to everyone watching, we have a few minutes left, so if you have any questions, please chime in. Dr. Holmes is doing a great job of reminding us why we love this country. A question here, how can we promote American exceptionalism?
The first thing, make sure that you understand American civics, educate yourself, understand what the history of America, understand the history of the Revolution, understand the history of the Constitution and the Declaration, understand how it all fits together. Because one of the reasons why over the last 30 or 40 years we've started losing all of this is because it's not taught in our schools anymore. It's taught in the sort of special cases and places, homeschooling and places like that, but the broad belief in it as a matter of public education was lost. And so there was just a blank slate there on many, not just young people, but people now that are fully adults. And when you talk about this to them, they kind of blink at you and say, what was that again? When did that happen? I mean, you have to know what you're talking about. Otherwise, when somebody throws a bunch of leftist ideas back at you, well, what about racism? You got to have an answer. What about this or what about that? And then the second thing is that once you have an understanding, just be absolutely relentless and promoting it and standing up to anybody, left or right, who tries to change the nature of the narrative and to tell you that something is outdated. The last thing we conservatives need to do is start adopting a kind of Marxist view of history where it unfolds over time and gets better in the future. And therefore, we have to keep up with the times, and we let the times define who we are. We believe in permanent principles. That's what makes us conservatives. Some people on the right now saying, the conservatism I'm talking about right now is outdated. This is exactly what the left has been saying for well over a century. It's a progressive, historicist, Hegelian view of history that is really deadly because it undermines the sense of belief that we really take our future from our past. And the reason we do is because the past is right. It's not just because it's past. It's not nostalgia. It's not like, if you're a nationalist in Europe, they revere the past too, but they revere the past because it's their ancestors. They don't make any claims about it being a German make no claim about being right for the French. It's only right for the Germans. That's why we're different. It's based upon a universal principle. And so if we don't have respect for that, don't understand it, and don't promote it across the board, it will be lost.
And again, we have amazing resources on heritage.org that we will link in the comments as well. Great commentaries, op-eds, reports about the importance of a return to learning civics in schools and what's going on right now with homeschooling and how parents and teachers can take back teaching children what is important. And a great question right here from Kathleen. How can we address and reverse the regression in the education system?
We talk about that all the time at Heritage. We have a lot. They have a book coming out, by the way, that maybe Augusta can tell you how to find it when it comes out, addressing this very topic across the board. But I have 2 minutes, and so the short answer is that parents have got to take back control of the schools and take it away from the unions, take it away from the politicians. Organize yourself. Do not let them impose these curricular changes on you that you only discover in passing. The hard left, all the way back to the 1960s, when they failed to make the revolution back then, they pulled back and they knew they couldn't do it through the streets. And then they said, well, okay, we'll march through the institutions. And the most important institution to march through and to indoctrinate future Americans is our schools. And believe me, we are now reaping the whirlwind of this. If you look at some of the things that are being taught in our schools, the universities are, of course, where most of this poison is invented. And if we don't have some kind of a return of universities to the task of actually educating children rather than indoctrinating them, giving them the tools and the ability to get through life, rather than to march into a certain ideological point of view. I mean, if the only way it's going to be done is if parents organize, they hold their political and their government officials and the Congress and the states in particular accountable, make it a top issue. There's no reason why publicly funded state universities, paid with taxpayers' money, should be funding this kind of poison in the classroom of their universities about how America is one of the worst countries on the face of the earth, gender ideologies, and the whole thing is that it just completely, it's worse than turning their back on civics. It's actually created an alternative view of America that has been, as I said, marching through the schools and the universities now for some time. And also, the last thing I'll say about this is that we conservatives we put a lot of stock in the last 50 years in politics. We think we have a president who will save us, and we think that's all we need. We need to elect good people. Well, I'm here to tell you it is not enough. No president, no Congress, no governor can save you from what the schools are doing unless we conservatives march through the institutions again, like we once had them. We have to get into the school districts. We have to get into the schools, PTA meetings. You have to organize and do what the left has done for the last 50 years. They've taken over the school system and the education system from the bottom up, from the side, with a sanction from the people on the top, with money flowing in from all sorts of ways. It was a very concerted strategy. We need to be just as sophisticated as they were.
And as Dr. Holmes mentioned, we have great resources on heritage.org. We will link some of that education content in the comments for you to check out. You can always check out heritage.org. We feature content at the top. So right now we have a microschooling manual up, which talks about this as well. Be sure to follow us on Facebook and stay tuned because we post it all there. So just stay tuned for all of that good content. We have a time for about 2 more questions. Here is one from Ken. Are nationalism and globalism compatible?
Well, it's an interesting question. It depends on how you define each one of them. If you define globalism as a kind of a transnational superstate, as if somehow the United Nations was in charge, no, they're not. But interestingly enough, though, the very first ideas of the nation state 400 years ago when they first arrived, it was after the 30 Years' War in the Peace of Westphalia, where the nation state was actually recognized as independent from the Holy Roman Empire and the Church and the like. At that point, there was an international order of nation states. It respected the sovereignty of the nation state. In that international dimension, the way we're talking about it here, the American nation, if you will, and our sovereignty as a civil government fits better into that scenario than into the globalist one where the UN decides for us. You know, we derive the legitimacy, if you will, as Americans to make our own decisions and not have the UN make them because of the nature of our civil government and the belief in natural law, none of which, by the way, the UN believes in. So the problem with globalism is not that they have that no transnational institution, UN or otherwise, should have a right to tell Americans how to live. But apart from that, the reason why is because they have no moral grounds from the point of view of Americans to do so. When I was Assistant Secretary of State back in the Bush administration, I remember one time sitting in a meeting, and somebody from Sudan, I believe it was, he said, you know, we Sudanese, you know, believe in national sovereignty just like you Americans do. And at the time, Sudan was committing genocide against millions of people. And they were trying to use America's protection of its sovereignty as a cover for them to kill their people. And I just held my hand. I said, no, wait a minute, guys. You know, there's no comparison. So don't use this national sovereignty or nationalism blanket to protect what you're doing to your people. We have a government that respects the rights of the people. That's what gives us the prerogative and legitimacy to say no to the UN. You see the difference? It's a big difference.
All right, I think we have time for maybe one more question. And this is a good one, something that I think a lot of us are approached about often, just given the current state of affairs right now. This is from Jerry. Dr. Holmes, do you see any chance that the current political tribalism and deadlock can be mitigated so that leaders can once again meet in the middle? What would have to be done for that to happen?
Well, first of all, it's going to take time, and it's going to take some kind of a shift in our society. Right now, we're in a standoff, and unfortunately, the checks and balances of the constitutional system that is good in the sense that it prevents tyranny. Also, the other side of that coin is that when you've got a polarized electorate, it pretty much freezes with the polarized electorate. And so the things that makes it good on the one hand also weakens it on the other. And so our political system will never by itself get us out of this deadlock that we're in. Something has to change in the hearts and minds of Americans. I think that frankly, the progressive hard left that exists right now has to be discredited, not so much by us, we can do that, but by people on the other side of the aisle who are definitely distressed by it, but because of the politics and the power struggle, they're not willing to denounce it, at least wholeheartedly. So something has to happen in the hearts and minds of the left, which means that something has to happen in the hearts and minds of Americans who are electing people who tolerate this sort of thing. So it's going to have to be bottom up. I actually, when I say take time, I mean, when I said a minute ago about march to the institutions, I'm taking the long view here, 10, 20 years. It may not change until we get our schools back under some kind of reasonable control for the parents. It may not happen unless the universities take a different route. In other words, right now the culture is all moving in the wrong direction. Civil society with corporate America, with even the churches are moving in the progressive direction, and the politics is following that. So we have to go back in and start taking the culture back. And the only way to do that is to get involved and to be very clear in your mind what that means. And then the politics will follow. But I just don't think the politics, just by voting for President Trump or anybody else alone, is going to do it. Because even if he is elected, what you're seeing right now will more or less continue.
Absolutely. We have to fight for America. So in closing, we're about at time. Do you have anything that we did not mention that you think our audience should know that we have not mentioned yet?
Yes, I would. It's something I've been thinking about in some writings I'm doing. Individualism is important in American history. We've always believed in the individual. Sometimes it was called rugged individualism, people going out west and in their wagons and taking care of themselves and their family. There was always a kind of an admiration and respect for the individual. And that's been part of our creed, that's been part of our history. But that it should not be confused with sort of a radical individualism of license and of self-gratification and the like. One of the reasons why the left has been so successful over the last 50 years is they hijacked the idea of individual freedom and turned it into, on the one hand, a kind of endless personal perfection of gratification and pleasure and having a good time. And so, you couldn't judge anybody because they had individual rights. They took it and completely divorced it from virtue and from personal responsibility and made it all about gratification and self-fulfillment. And so now, as a result of that hijacking, it's actually a perversion of what the original individualism meant. Because of that, some conservatives are starting to turn against individualism and freedom. And I just say, don't do that. Be careful about that. Take individualism back to what it was meant to be. As the individual decided what was right and wrong for them, but the civil society mediated between the individual and morality what that should be. There was a role for the churches, there was a role for morality, there's a role for virtue. What we have to do in this country is get virtue back. We have to get morality back. If we get that back, the civil society will start following it, and eventually the politics will follow it. But we can't, skip over, grab power of the state, and turn around and say, I'm going to make everybody be moral. At that point, what will happen is it will be just as corrupted as if the progressives control it.
Powerful stuff. Given these crazy and uncertain times, it's definitely great to remember, and it's important to remember what makes America exceptional. So we thank you so much for your time today, Dr. Holmes.
Thank you, Augusta. Thanks, everybody, for attending.
Yes, thank you all for joining us today, and we hope that you have a great rest of your week, and we will see you next time on the Heritage Foundation's Ask the Expert.